The forest was cloaked in darkness, its tall trees swaying under the whisper of a cold, biting wind. Dead leaves crunched beneath the boots of a man dragging a reluctant horse behind him. The horse, a stunning chestnut thoroughbred, let out a distressed snort, its large eyes darting nervously at the shadows around them. Every muscle in the animal's body was tense, as if it could sense something its handler could not. The man tightened his grip on the reins, muttering under his breath as they reached a clearing in the woods. The tree in the middle stood tall and unyielding, its thick trunk seeming to promise no escape. The man stopped, tied the horse's reins to the tree with a firm knot, and stepped back to admire his work. The horse, Magnum, pawed the ground anxiously, its breath visible in the crisp night air. It let out a shrill whinny that echoed through the forest, as if calling for help. "Shut up," the man snapped, his tone cold and dismissive. "You're not worth the noise." Victor Harland, a man whose wealth was rivaled only by his arrogance, lit a cigarette and inhaled deeply. He glanced back at the horse with a smirk. Magnum wasn't just any horse. He was a thoroughbred, worth hundreds of thousands of dollars on the racing circuit. But to Victor, the horse was nothing more than a symbol of failure, a gift from a former business partner who had betrayed him and cost him millions. Victor spat on the ground. "You'll make a nice meal for the wolves. At least someone will get some use out of you." Magnum, still tethered to the tree, let out another desperate cry, his ears flicking wildly at the sounds of the forest. There was movement in the shadows. The faint glow of yellow eyes began to appear, one by one, surrounding the clearing. The wolves had arrived. They moved with eerie silence, their sleek gray bodies blending almost seamlessly into the darkness. Their eyes gleamed with hunger, and their low growls rumbled like distant thunder. Leading the pack was a large male, his thick fur streaked with scars that spoke of countless battles. He moved closer, his gaze fixed on Magnum with predatory intensity. Victor watched from the edge of the clearing, his smirk widening as he exhaled a cloud of smoke. He had no intention of staying long, just enough to witness the beginning of the end. "Good luck, Magnum," he muttered, turning his back to leave. The wolves closed in, circling the trembling horse. Magnum strained against the rope, his hooves scraping the dirt as he tried to pull free. But the knot held firm. His wide eyes darted between the predators, his breathing rapid and shallow. The lead wolf took a cautious step forward, baring its teeth. Magnum froze, his muscles quivering as the predator sniffed the air, moving closer with deliberate, measured steps. Victor paused mid-stride, glancing back over his shoulder. He expected chaos, a flurry of claws and fangs, the cries of the doomed horse. But what he saw instead made him stop in his tracks. The lead wolf wasn't attacking. Instead, it tilted its head slightly, studying Magnum with an expression almost curious. The horse, though trembling, didn't flinch. For a moment, their eyes locked, wild predator meeting helpless prey. But there was something in Magnum's gaze, a quiet defiance that seemed to give the wolf pause. The pack hesitated, their growls softening as they looked to their leader for direction. The large wolf let out a low, guttural sound, not a snarl, but something calmer. He took a step back. Magnum did something unexpected then. He lowered his head slightly, a movement that almost seemed like an acknowledgement, a surrender without fear. Victor blinked, confused. What the hell? The wolves began to retreat, one by one, disappearing into the shadows of the forest. The lead wolf lingered for a moment, his piercing gaze still locked on the horse, before finally turning and vanishing into the trees. Magnum was left alone, still tied to the tree, his chest rising and falling with heavy breaths. The forest was silent again, except for the faint rustle of leaves in the wind. Victor stomped out his cigarette, frustration bubbling inside him. This wasn't how it was supposed to go. He had expected the wolves to rip the horse apart, a fitting punishment for what Magnum represented in his mind. But instead, the wolves had spared him. Victor took one last look at the horse before walking away, muttering curses under his breath. He didn't know it yet, but what had just happened in that clearing was only the beginning. The night still had many secrets to reveal, and by the end of it, nothing would ever be the same. Victor's boots crunched through the undergrowth as he made his way back to his truck, parked on a dirt road just beyond the tree line. He kept glancing over his shoulder, his mind racing with disbelief. The wolves had spared the horse. How was that possible? Wolves didn't hesitate. They didn't stop to think. They attacked. Yet tonight, they had walked away as if something about Magnum had unnerved them. Sliding into the driver's seat, Victor slammed the door shut and sat in silence for a moment. His fingers drummed on the steering wheel as his jaw tightened. That horse was supposed to be gone by now, a sacrifice to the merciless forces of nature. Victor needed the satisfaction, the closure, of knowing that the symbol of his failure had been erased. With a growl of frustration, he turned the key in the ignition, and the truck's engine roared to life. The headlights illuminated the forest in front of him, but his mind was miles away, replaying the scene over and over. The way Magnum had locked eyes with the wolf. The way the leader of the pack had backed off, as if responding to some unspoken message. Victor shook his head. "Ridiculous," he muttered. "It's just an animal." He didn't drive away immediately. Something gnawed at him, a strange sensation he couldn't quite name. It wasn't guilt. Victor Harlan didn't do guilt. It was curiosity. Against his better judgment, he reached for his binoculars, which he always kept stashed in the glove compartment. He stepped out of the truck and made his way quietly back toward the clearing, careful to stay hidden behind the thick brush. His boots made almost no sound now, his steps deliberate. When he reached the edge of the clearing, he crouched low, bringing the binoculars to his eyes. Magnum was still there, tied to the tree, his powerful frame silhouetted against the pale moonlight. The horse was no longer trembling. He stood still, his ears twitching slightly as if listening to something far away. Victor scanned the shadows, expecting to see the wolves lingering nearby. But the forest seemed empty, eerily quiet. No rustling leaves, no distant howls. Even the wind had died down, leaving a suffocating stillness in its wake. Magnum let out a low, almost mournful sound, his head dipping slightly. Victor frowned. The horse's posture was strange, almost human in its expression of sadness. "Why are you still alive?" Victor muttered under his breath. As if in answer, Magnum raised his head sharply, his ears pointing forward. The horse's gaze shifted, not toward Victor, but toward the far edge of the clearing. Victor followed the horse's line of sight and froze. The wolves were back. But something was different this time. The pack emerged from the shadows slowly, their movements cautious, almost reverent. They didn't snarl or growl. Instead, they sat down in a semicircle, surrounding the horse at a distance. The leader, the scarred male, stood at the center, his golden eyes fixed on Magnum. Victor's heart pounded in his chest as he watched the scene unfold. He'd hunted wolves before, years ago on a trip to Alaska, and he knew their behavior well. This wasn't hunting. This was something else entirely. The lead wolf stepped forward, stopping just a few feet from Magnum. The horse remained still, his body relaxed despite the presence of predators. For a moment, it was as if the two were communicating. Victor shook his head, his knuckles whitening as he gripped the binoculars. "Wolves don't act like this," he whispered, his voice trembling slightly. The scarred wolf tilted his head again, just like before, and let out a low, almost melodic sound, a sound that sent chills down Victor's spine. It wasn't a growl. It was a howl, but softer, more restrained. The other wolves echoed the call, their voices blending into a haunting symphony. Victor's binoculars trembled in his hands. He could feel the hair on the back of his neck standing on end. He wanted to leave, to get back in his truck and never look back, but he couldn't tear his eyes away from the bizarre scene unfolding before him. Magnum lowered his head again, the same subtle motion he'd made earlier, and the wolves fell silent. The leader stepped closer, close enough that Victor was sure an attack was coming this time. But instead, the wolf sniffed the air near Magnum's muzzle before sitting down on its haunches. Victor cursed under his breath, his mind reeling. This wasn't just unusual, it was impossible. Animals didn't behave this way. There was no explanation for it, at least none that Victor could understand. Finally, the lead wolf turned and trotted back into the shadows, followed by the rest of the pack. Within seconds, the clearing was empty again, leaving only Magnum tied to the tree. Victor lowered the binoculars, his hands shaking. His breath came in short, shallow bursts as he tried to process what he'd just seen. "This isn't over," he muttered to himself, his voice tinged with unease. Back at the tree, Magnum let out a soft exhale, his ears flicking toward the direction the wolves had gone. For a brief moment, his gaze seemed to shift toward Victor's hiding spot. It was just a flicker, but it was enough to make Victor's blood run cold. He stood abruptly, stumbling back toward his truck. Whatever was happening out here, he wanted no part of it. But as he climbed into the driver's seat and slammed the door shut, he couldn't shake the feeling that he was being watched. The forest, now silent and still, seemed to hold its breath, as if waiting for what would happen next. Victor couldn't escape the images that had burned themselves into his mind. The wolves circling Magnum, their golden eyes fixed on the horse, not with hunger but with something almost like reverence. And Magnum, standing there as if he belonged among them. The memory had kept Victor awake all night, staring at the ceiling of his mansion. The house was silent, but Victor's mind wasn't. He had built this estate as a testament to his success, a sprawling property at the edge of the forest, with sleek furniture and glass walls that let him survey his kingdom. Yet, for the first time, he felt uneasy in his own home. The forest loomed outside, endless and alive, and Victor couldn't help but feel that it was watching him. By morning, his frustration had reached a boiling point. He stood in the living room, staring out the window at the tree line, his third coffee of the day growing cold in his hand. He tried to convince himself it was nothing, just animals acting strangely. Nothing more. But no matter how much he told himself that, he couldn't let it go. Claire, his assistant, entered the room with her usual brisk efficiency. She held a tablet in one hand, already rattling off updates about contractors and schedules. But she paused mid-sentence when she saw his expression. "Mr. Harland? Are you okay?" she asked, her voice careful. Victor didn't respond immediately. His gaze remained fixed on the forest. Finally, he muttered, "Have you ever seen wolves act strangely?" Claire blinked, taken aback by the question. Strange how? Victor frowned. How could he explain it without sounding insane? The wolves' hesitation, their apparent acknowledgement of Magnum, it defied everything he knew about predators. "Never mind," he said gruffly, brushing her off. Claire hesitated, clearly unsure, but eventually nodded. "Okay." The contractor called. Later, Victor interrupted sharply. He set his coffee down and grabbed his jacket. "I need to take care of something." "Do you need me to?" "No," he said curtly, already heading for the door. The drive back to the clearing felt longer this time. The dirt road twisted and turned through the forest, each bend making Victor's chest tighten with anticipation. He hadn't planned on coming back. He'd assumed Magnum would be gone by now, either taken by wolves or left to starve. But something about the scene last night had unsettled him in a way he couldn't ignore. When he reached the clearing, he parked the truck and stepped out, his boots crunching on the soft earth. The forest was eerily quiet, the kind of silence that made the hair on the back of his neck stand up. And then he saw him. Magnum was still there. The horse stood calmly under the tree, his chestnut coat gleaming in the sunlight. He didn't look weak or frightened. In fact, he seemed strong, almost regal. Victor stopped in his tracks, staring in disbelief. The rope that had bound Magnum to the tree was still there, but it had been chewed through in one spot, as if by sharp teeth. Victor's eyes scanned the ground. Paw prints. Wolf tracks circled the tree in deliberate patterns, not chaotic as he would have expected from predators. Victor clenched his fists, his mind racing. This doesn't make sense. Magnum turned his head, his large, intelligent eyes meeting Victor's. For a moment, Victor felt something stir deep in his chest, a strange pull that made him feel like the horse was trying to tell him something. And then the rustling began. Victor's head snapped toward the edge of the clearing, his heart pounding. The wolves were back. This time, there were only 3. They stepped out of the shadows slowly, their golden eyes fixed on Victor. They didn't snarl or growl. They simply watched. Victor's hand instinctively went to the knife on his belt. His fingers tightened around the handle, though he wasn't sure what he planned to do with it. The wolves made no move toward him. The scarred leader took a step forward, his movements calm and deliberate. The other 2 wolves hung back, their postures relaxed but attentive. Victor's throat tightened. "What do you want?" he growled, his voice shaky. The leader tilted his head slightly, just as he had the night before. He let out a low, mournful sound that sent chills down Victor's spine. It wasn't a growl. It was something softer, almost pleading. Victor stared at the wolf, his chest tightening. For a moment, he thought he understood. The wolf wasn't threatening him. It was trying to communicate. The leader glanced at Magnum, then back at Victor, as if urging him to act. Victor blinked, shaking his head. This was ridiculous. Wolves didn't act like this. Animals didn't act like this. But the longer he stood there, the more he felt the weight of the wolf's gaze, as if it was pressing into him, demanding something he couldn't name. Finally, the leader turned and disappeared back into the shadows, the other 2 wolves following silently. Victor stood frozen, his mind racing. The silence in the clearing was deafening. He looked back at Magnum, who stood calmly, his ears twitching as if listening to something Victor couldn't hear. With a shaky breath, Victor loosened the rope. Magnum didn't resist. He stepped forward willingly, his hooves crunching softly on the forest floor. Victor glanced over his shoulder as they walked back to the truck. The forest seemed alive, its shadows shifting as if unseen eyes were watching their every move. Whatever had happened here, Victor knew one thing: this wasn't the end. It was only the beginning. Victor drove in silence, the truck's rumble steady as it carried him and the horse back to his estate. In the rearview mirror, he could see Magnum through the slats of the trailer. The horse stood motionless, his calm demeanor unnerving. Victor tightened his grip on the wheel, his mind racing. He had told himself that bringing Magnum back was practical. Leaving the horse in the woods was no longer an option. If someone found him alive, questions would arise. Questions Victor couldn't answer. But deep down, he knew there was another reason. Something about the events in that clearing had left a mark on him, a nagging unease he couldn't shake. The wolves. The way they had acted. The way they had looked at him, as if they were waiting for him to understand something. Victor pulled into his estate, the tall iron gates parting with a low hum. The stable yard was quiet, the air crisp as he parked near the barn. He climbed out, his boots crunching on the gravel. Opening the trailer, he found Magnum waiting, still unervingly composed. Victor grabbed the lead rope and expected resistance, but Magnum stepped out gracefully, his movements fluid and deliberate. The horse's eyes met Victor's, calm and steady, and for a moment Victor felt unmoored. He led Magnum into the barn, where the scent of hay and leather greeted them. The empty stalls were immaculate, remnants of Victor's once thriving thoroughbred operation. Magnum moved without hesitation, stepping into a stall as if he belonged there. Victor secured the door and stood back, watching the horse. Magnum sniffed the fresh bedding, then settled into a relaxed stance, his eyes half closed. Victor rubbed his jaw, a mix of frustration and confusion knotting in his chest. "This doesn't mean anything," Victor said aloud, as if trying to convince himself. "You're just a horse." Magnum didn't react. His stillness was unnerving, almost deliberate. Victor turned and left the barn, needing air. He walked across the stable yard, the sharp breeze biting at his skin. The forest loomed in the distance, its shadowed edges tugging at his thoughts. The wolves had spared Magnum. That fact gnawed at him, defying logic. Wolves didn't act like that. They didn't hesitate, didn't retreat. And yet they had. Victor exhaled sharply, trying to shake the thoughts away. He glanced at the forest, his pulse quickening. 4 years, it had been a backdrop to his life, a symbol of the wildness he believed he had tamed. Now, it felt alien, unknowable. By the time the sun began to dip below the horizon, Victor found himself back in the barn. He didn't know why he had returned. He told himself it was to check on Magnum, but the truth was, he felt compelled to. Magnum stood in his stall, his head low as if dozing. When Victor stepped closer, the horse lifted his head, his ears flicking toward him. Victor hesitated at the stall door. For a man who had faced down ruthless business deals and dangerous competitors, the act of stepping inside felt strangely daunting. But he pushed the feeling aside and entered the stall. Magnum didn't move. His calm, watchful gaze followed Victor as he approached. Slowly, Victor reached out and placed a hand on the horse's neck. Magnum's coat was warm, his muscles solid beneath Victor's palm. The horse leaned into the touch, his presence steady and grounding. Victor let out a breath he hadn't realized he was holding. The tension in his shoulders eased slightly as he stood there, his hand resting on the horse. "You're not normal," Victor muttered, his voice quiet. "I don't know what you are, but you're not normal." Magnum let out a soft snort, his ears twitching forward. Victor pulled his hand back and left the stall, his steps slow. As he walked out of the barn, he couldn't shake the feeling that Magnum's gaze was still on him, steady and unyielding. That night, Victor sat in his study, staring out the window at the forest. The moon hung low, casting long shadows across the trees. He thought of the wolves again, their strange behavior, the way they had seemed to communicate with Magnum. And then he thought of Magnum himself, standing so calmly in the clearing, as if he belonged there. Victor didn't believe in fate or signs, but for the first time, he felt like he was standing at the edge of something far bigger than himself, something he couldn't control or understand. The forest loomed silently in the distance, its darkness holding secrets Victor wasn't sure he wanted to uncover. Victor couldn't get the sound out of his head. That distant howl, carried on the wind, had cut through the morning quiet like a blade. It wasn't the first time he had heard wolves near his estate, but this time, it felt different. It was almost as if the sound was directed at him, beckoning him back to the forest. Standing in his kitchen, he stared at the cold remains of his untouched coffee. He couldn't focus on anything else. His gaze kept drifting to the window, to the line of trees that stretched endlessly into the horizon. The woods seemed to hum with unseen energy, pulling at him in a way he didn't understand. The barn was silent when Victor entered. Magnum stood at the stall door, his chestnut coat gleaming in the soft light that filtered through the slatted windows. His ears flicked toward Victor, his calm gaze following the man's every move. "You hear it too, don't you?" Victor muttered, half joking, though the weight in his chest was no laughing matter. Magnum didn't respond, of course, but his stillness spoke volumes. He stood as if waiting for Victor to do something, his presence steady and unshakable. Victor grabbed the lead rope and hesitated. He told himself this was absurd. There was no logical reason to return to the forest, no reason to drag the horse back to that strange clearing. But the feeling gnawed at him, relentless. The wolves had acted so unnaturally, and Magnum's composure only deepened the mystery. Victor couldn't let it go. "I must be losing my mind," he muttered as he opened the stall door. Magnum stepped out without hesitation, his movements smooth and deliberate. Victor loaded the horse into the trailer, the sound of the ramp closing breaking the silence of the morning. He climbed into the truck, gripping the steering wheel tightly as he drove down the long driveway. The iron gates opened with their usual mechanical hum, and soon the estate was behind him. The drive toward the forest felt longer than it should have. Each turn in the road seemed to stretch the distance, as if the woods were testing his resolve. The air grew heavier, more charged, the closer he got. When he reached the edge of the clearing, Victor parked and stepped out, the morning sun casting long shadows across the ground. He opened the trailer and led Magnum out. The horse's ears twitched, and he raised his head, his nostrils flaring as he sniffed the air. Victor paused. "What are you sensing?" he asked, though he didn't expect an answer. Magnum let out a soft snort, his gaze fixed on the distant tree line. Victor led the horse into the clearing, the familiar space unchanged yet somehow different. The tree where Magnum had been tied still bore faint marks of the rope, but the air felt thicker, heavier. The forest seemed to press in around them, its shadows deeper and more alive. Then, without warning, Magnum let out a piercing whinny that echoed through the trees. The sound was sharp, commanding, and it sent chills down Victor's spine. "What the hell are you doing?" Victor muttered, looking around nervously. A rustling sound came from the shadows, and Victor's pulse quickened. One by one, the wolves appeared. There were 5 of them this time, their golden eyes glowing in the dim light. The scarred leader moved to the front, his movements slow and deliberate. Victor's grip on the lead rope tightened as the wolves approached, his chest tightening with unease. The leader stopped a few feet from Magnum, his gaze shifting briefly to Victor before locking onto the horse. The tension in the air was palpable, the clearing unnaturally quiet. Victor's instincts screamed at him to retreat, to get Magnum back to the truck and leave. But something held him in place, a strange pull he couldn't explain. The scarred wolf tilted his head slightly and let out a low, rumbling sound. It wasn't a growl, it was softer, almost like a question. Magnum responded with a soft nicker, his ears flicking forward. Victor stood frozen, his breath shallow as he watched the exchange. The other wolves sat back on their haunches, their eyes fixed on Magnum and the leader. The scarred wolf let out a long, mournful howl. The sound resonated through the trees, deep and haunting, sending shivers down Victor's spine. The other wolves joined in, their voices blending into a chorus that seemed to echo from the very soul of the forest. Magnum didn't move. He stood tall, his gaze steady and calm, his ears twitching slightly as the sound filled the air. When the howling stopped, the leader turned and disappeared into the shadows, the rest of the pack following silently. Victor let out a shaky breath, his legs feeling weak beneath him. He turned to Magnum, who remained still, his posture unshaken. "What is this?" Victor whispered, his voice trembling. Magnum turned his head slightly, his calm gaze meeting Victor's. It was almost as if the horse was waiting for him to figure it out. Victor led Magnum back to the trailer, his hands unsteady on the lead rope. The walk felt longer this time, the weight of what he had witnessed pressing down on him. As they drove away, Victor couldn't shake the feeling that the wolves and the forest itself were still watching him, their presence lingering in the shadows. Whatever this was, it wasn't over. Victor sat in his study late that night, the dim glow of the desk lamp casting long shadows across the room. The glass of scotch in his hand trembled slightly, the ice clinking as he raised it to his lips. The memory of the wolves, their piercing eyes and haunting howls, played over and over in his mind. No matter how hard he tried to rationalize it, there was no explanation that made sense. Magnum was back in the barn, as calm and composed as ever. Victor had checked on him after returning from the clearing, but the horse seemed entirely unbothered by the events of the day. If anything, Magnum's serenity only deepened Victor's unease. It was as though the horse was part of something Victor couldn't see, something he couldn't begin to understand. He set the glass down and rubbed his temples. He had always been a man of control, someone who shaped his world to fit his will. But this situation defied control. The forest, the wolves, even Magnum, they were part of something far older and far wilder than Victor had ever encountered. The house was silent, save for the occasional creak of wood as it settled in the cool night air. Victor stared out the large window of his study, the forest looming in the distance. The moonlight bathed the trees in an eerie glow, their shadows stretching like fingers across the landscape. For a moment, he thought he saw movement at the edge of the woods, a flash of light, or perhaps a reflection. He leaned forward, his pulse quickening. There it was again. Victor stood, the chair scraping against the hardwood floor as he moved toward the window. His breath fogged the glass as he stared, his eyes scanning the tree line. He could swear he saw the faint glint of golden eyes, watching him from the darkness. His chest tightened. He had convinced himself that the wolves were a mystery best left alone, but now they seemed to be following him, pressing closer, even as he tried to distance himself. A low nicker broke the silence, startling him. Victor turned sharply, realizing it had come from the barn. Magnum. He grabbed his jacket and headed outside, the cold night air biting at his skin. The crunch of gravel under his boots echoed loudly in the stillness. As he approached the barn, he hesitated. Something felt off. The building, which had always been a place of order and calm, now seemed heavy with tension. Pushing the door open, Victor stepped inside. The familiar sense of hay and leather greeted him, but the atmosphere was different. Magnum stood at the stall door, his head raised, his ears flicking toward the far end of the barn. "What is it?" Victor asked quietly, though he wasn't expecting an answer. Magnum let out another low nicker, his breath visible in the cool air. Victor followed the horse's gaze, his heart pounding as he noticed something strange. The sliding barn door at the back, which he always kept closed, was slightly ajar. Victor approached slowly, his every step careful. He pushed the door open further and froze. There, just beyond the threshold, stood the scarred wolf. Its golden eyes locked onto Victor's, unblinking. The wolf didn't snarl or growl. It simply stood there, its presence commanding and calm. Victor's hand hovered near the knife on his belt, his instincts screaming at him to act. But he didn't move. Something about the wolf's gaze rooted him to the spot. It wasn't aggression. It wasn't fear. It was something deeper, something Victor couldn't put into words. Magnum let out a soft exhale, breaking the silence. The wolf's ears flicked toward the sound, and its gaze shifted to the horse. For a moment, the two animals seemed to communicate in a way Victor couldn't comprehend. Then, without a sound, the wolf turned and disappeared into the night. Victor stood there for what felt like an eternity, his breath coming in shallow bursts. When he finally stepped back into the barn, his legs felt weak, his mind racing. He closed the sliding door and leaned against it, trying to steady himself. Magnum stood in his stall, calm as ever, his gaze following Victor with quiet intensity. "What the hell is going on?" Victor muttered, his voice barely audible. He didn't sleep that night. Instead, he sat in the living room, staring out the window at the forest. The encounter with the wolf replayed in his mind, every detail etched into his memory. Victor had spent years believing he was the master of his world, that he could bend anything to his will with enough effort. But now, he felt small, insignificant in the face of something far greater than himself. As the first light of dawn broke over the horizon, Victor made a decision. He couldn't ignore this anymore. The wolves, the forest, even Magnum, they were all connected. And if he wanted answers, He would have to face whatever was waiting for him in those woods. He glanced at the barn, where Magnum stood silhouetted against the rising sun. The horse had been the catalyst for all of this, and Victor couldn't shake the feeling that Magnum held the key to understanding it. "All right," Victor said aloud, his voice firm despite the fear gnawing at him. "Let's see where this leads." The forest loomed in the distance, its shadows deep and inviting. The morning air was thick with fog, its cool dampness clinging to Victor as he stood by the barn, staring at the distant forest. The trees loomed in the hazy light, their dark silhouettes standing still, yet alive with a pull Victor couldn't ignore. No matter how much he tried to convince himself to stay, the urge to return to the woods gnawed at him. Beside him, Magnum waited, calm as ever. The horse's composure should have been reassuring, but instead it unsettled Victor. Magnum wasn't agitated or hesitant. In fact, he seemed eager, his ears flicking toward the forest as though listening for something only he could hear. Victor sighed, gripping the lead rope. "All right," he muttered, more to himself than to the horse. "Let's see where this leads." With practiced motions, he loaded Magnum into the trailer. The ramp clattered shut, and soon the truck was rumbling down the familiar dirt road. Each twist and turn of the path brought him closer to the clearing, the weight in his chest growing heavier. The forest felt different now, as though it was waiting for him. When he arrived, the clearing looked the same as before, but the air carried an almost electric tension. Victor unloaded Magnum, who stepped out with his usual grace, his ears swiveling as he scanned the surroundings. Victor hesitated at the edge of the clearing, his fingers tightening on the rope. "What am I even doing here?" he muttered. But Magnum stepped forward, pulling gently on the lead rope. The horse's calm confidence was impossible to ignore, and Victor let himself be led to the center of the clearing. Then the rustling began. Victor froze, his pulse quickening. The sound came from the shadows, growing louder with each passing second. The wolves appeared. They moved silently, their golden eyes glowing faintly in the dim light. There were more of them now. Victor counted at least 8, their sleek bodies forming a loose circle around him and Magnum. At the front was the scarred leader, his presence commanding and calm. Victor's grip on the lead rope tightened. His instincts screamed at him to turn back, to retreat to the safety of his truck. But his feet refused to move. The scarred wolf stepped forward, his gaze shifting between Victor and Magnum. The air was so thick with tension that Victor could hear his own heartbeat. "What do you want from me?" he asked aloud, his voice breaking the silence. The wolf tilted his head slightly, his golden eyes locked onto Victor. Then, with a low, mournful sound, he let out a soft howl that sent chills down Victor's spine. Magnum responded with a quiet nicker, stepping forward slightly. The horse's calmness was unnerving, but Victor couldn't bring himself to stop him. The scarred wolf turned and began to walk toward the edge of the clearing. He paused, glancing back at Victor and Magnum, his golden eyes almost urging them to follow. Victor hesitated, his chest tightening. "You've got to be kidding me," he muttered. But Magnum took another step forward, tugging lightly on the lead rope. Against his better judgment, Victor followed. The wolves led them deeper into the forest, their movements silent and deliberate. The sunlight above faded as the canopy thickened, casting the ground in shifting shadows. The further they went, the heavier the air felt, as though the forest itself were alive, its presence pressing in on all sides. Victor's nerves were on edge, every step feeling like a test of his resolve. He wanted to turn back, to leave this strange journey behind, but the quiet determination in Magnum's posture kept him moving forward. After what felt like hours, the wolves stopped. Victor found himself in a smaller clearing, enclosed by towering trees that seemed older than anything he'd ever seen. At the center of the clearing was a large, flat stone covered in moss and strange markings. The symbols were intricate, their edges worn by time, yet they seemed to pulse faintly with a light Victor couldn't quite see. "What is this place?" he whispered, his voice barely audible. The scarred wolf sat at the base of the stone, his golden eyes fixed on Victor. The other wolves positioned themselves around the edges of the clearing, their presence silent but heavy. Magnum stepped forward, his head lowering slightly as if bowing. Victor's grip on the lead rope slackened as he watched, his confusion deepening. "What are you doing?" he asked the horse, his voice trembling. Magnum stood still, his posture calm and deliberate. The scarred wolf let out a soft rumble, breaking the silence. It wasn't a growl, but something more complex, a sound that carried meaning Victor couldn't grasp. Against his better judgment, Victor stepped closer to the stone. The air grew heavier with each step, the faint hum of energy seeming to pulse through the ground beneath his feet. He reached out tentatively, his fingers hovering above one of the markings. The air around the stone felt charged, as though it were alive. Before he could touch it, the scarred wolf barked sharply, a sound that made Victor pull his hand back instinctively. Victor turned to the wolf, his chest heaving. "What do you want from me?" he demanded, his voice rising. The wolf didn't respond, but his gaze was steady, unyielding. In the silence, Victor felt something shift. The forest seemed to hum with life, the weight of its presence pressing down on him. This wasn't just about the wolves or the horse. It was something older, something far beyond anything Victor had ever encountered. Magnum remained still, his calm presence grounding Victor even as his mind raced. Victor exhaled shakily, his voice dropping to a whisper. "What have I gotten myself into?" The forest offered no answers, only the heavy stillness of its ancient shadows. Victor stood frozen in the clearing, the stone at its center exuding an energy he couldn't comprehend. The wolves surrounded the perimeter, their golden eyes watching in silence. The scarred leader remained closest to the stone, his gaze locked on Victor and Magnum with an intensity that made the air feel heavier. Magnum, calm and steady as always, took a step forward. The lead rope slackened in Victor's hand, but he didn't pull back. His instincts screamed for him to retreat, to turn away from this strange, ancient scene and leave it behind. Yet he couldn't. Something about the stone and the wolves rooted him in place, compelling him to stay. "What is this place?" Victor murmured, his voice barely audible. The scarred wolf tilted his head slightly, letting out a low, rumbling sound. It wasn't a growl, it was something else entirely, a tone that carried weight and intention. Magnum responded with a soft nicker, his ears flicking forward as he stepped closer to the stone. Victor tightened his grip on the lead rope. "Don't," he began, his voice trembling. But Magnum didn't hesitate. The horse moved with deliberate purpose, his movements fluid and confident. He stopped just short of the stone, lowering his head to the strange markings carved into its surface. Victor's breath caught as he studied the stone up close. The symbols were intricate and deliberate, their edges worn with age but still distinct. They seemed to pulse faintly, as though alive with some unseen force. The air around the stone was thicker now, charged with a subtle hum that resonated in Victor's chest. The scarred wolf rose from his sitting position, his gaze shifting to Victor. The tension in the clearing thickened, every sound of the forest seeming to fade into silence. Victor took a cautious step forward, his heartbeat thundering in his ears. His boots crunched softly on the forest floor as he approached the stone. "What do you want from me?" he asked aloud, his voice shaky. The scarred wolf let out another low sound, almost like a sigh, before turning his attention back to Magnum. Victor hesitated, then reached out with a trembling hand, his fingers hovering just above the surface of the stone. The air around it seemed to ripple faintly, as though pushing back against him. When his fingers brushed the stone, a sudden rush of energy coursed through his body. Victor gasped, stumbling back as a flood of images overwhelmed his mind. He saw flashes of the forest, wild and untamed, bathed in the light of countless moons. He saw wolves running in perfect unison, their movements fluid and synchronized. He saw Magnum standing among them, not as prey but as something vital and revered. And then he saw the stone itself, surrounded by figures, both human and animal, gathered in silent reverence under a star-filled sky. The visions faded as quickly as they had come, leaving Victor breathless and shaken. He staggered, his legs unsteady, and looked at the scarred wolf. What was that?" he whispered, his voice barely audible. The scarred wolf stepped forward, his golden eyes piercing. Victor froze, his breath catching as the animal stopped just a few feet away. The wolf's gaze held an ancient wisdom, a depth that made Victor feel small and exposed. Magnum let out a soft exhale, breaking the tension. The wolf turned his attention to the horse, and for a moment the two seemed to communicate silently, their postures relaxed but deliberate. Then, without a sound, the scarred wolf turned and walked away, disappearing into the shadows of the trees. One by one, the other wolves followed, their movements silent and fluid until the clearing was empty again. Victor stood in stunned silence, the faint hum of the stone the only sound around him. He turned to Magnum, who remained calm, his gaze steady and unyielding. What is this?" Victor said, his voice barely above a whisper. The horse didn't respond, of course, but there was something in his posture, something in his stillness, that made Victor feel as though the answer was just beyond his grasp. Victor looked back at the stone, the intricate markings still glowing faintly under the moonlight. The air around it felt charged, alive with an energy that defied explanation. For the first time in years, Victor felt completely out of control. His carefully constructed life, built on power and logic, now seemed insignificant in the face of whatever he had stumbled into. He glanced at the forest, its dark shadows pressing in around the clearing. The wolves hadn't just led him here, they had revealed something, a connection he didn't yet understand but could feel deeply. Taking a shaky breath, Victor reached for Magnum's lead rope. "Let's go," he said, though the words felt hollow. The journey back to the truck was quiet, the dense canopy above swallowing the moonlight. Victor's thoughts raced as he tried to piece together what had just happened. The wolves, the visions, the stone, it was all too much. When they finally reached the truck, Victor loaded Magnum into the trailer with mechanical motions, his mind still lost in the clearing. As he climbed into the driver's seat and started the engine, he couldn't shake the feeling that the forest was watching him, its presence lingering in the shadows. As the truck rumbled down the dirt road, Victor glanced at the rearview mirror. The reflection of the forest grew smaller with each passing mile, but the weight of what he had seen stayed with him. This wasn't over. Whatever the wolves had shown him, whatever the stone represented, it had set something in motion that Victor couldn't stop. And deep down, he knew it would change everything. Victor stood at the edge of the trail, staring into the dense forest shrouded in early morning mist. The air was heavy, the silence almost oppressive, as if the woods were waiting for him to take the next step. He tightened his grip on Magnum's lead rope, hesitating. The horse stood beside him, calm as always, his chestnut coat gleaming even in the muted light. Magnum's steady presence was both unsettling and grounding, as though he understood something Victor didn't. "Why do I keep coming back here?" Victor muttered to himself, but the question hung unanswered in the still air. Each step deeper into the forest felt like walking into a memory. The twisted branches overhead, the faint scent of moss and damp earth, it was all so familiar now. The visions he'd seen in the clearing haunted him. The glowing stone, the wolves' golden eyes, and the overwhelming sense that he was part of something far greater than himself. When they reached the clearing, Victor stopped. The stone was there, as before, its faint glow pulsing in rhythmic waves. The wolves were waiting too, their sleek forms scattered along the edges of the clearing, their golden eyes watching in silence. The scarred wolf stepped forward, his gaze locked on Victor. There was no aggression in his posture, only expectation. Victor's chest tightened. "I'm here." "What do you want from me?" he asked, his voice trembling. The scarred wolf tilted his head slightly, letting out a low, resonant sound that wasn't a growl but something more deliberate. Magnum shifted beside Victor, stepping forward with quiet confidence. The lead rope slipped from Victor's hand as the horse moved closer to the stone. Magnum stopped just before it, lowering his head to the intricate markings etched into its surface. The stone's glow brightened in response, its symbols pulsating in time with Magnum's breaths. Victor hesitated, then stepped forward. The hum in the air grew stronger, resonating in his chest like a second heartbeat. He turned to the scarred wolf, whose unblinking gaze held him in place. "What do you want me to do?" Victor asked, his voice low. The wolf didn't move but let out another low sound, almost like a sigh. The other wolves sat back, their golden eyes fixed on Victor and Magnum. Victor's hand trembled as he reached toward the stone. The energy in the clearing thickened, pressing against him as his fingers brushed the cold surface. A jolt of energy shot through him, and Victor gasped, staggering slightly as his vision blurred. Images flooded his mind, clearer than before, more vivid. He saw the forest, wild and untouched, alive with movement. Wolves and horses ran together, their connection seamless and unbroken. Then he saw himself. Not the man he was now, but someone tied to the forest, connected to its rhythms and purpose. He felt the weight of centuries pressing down on him, not as a burden, but as a reminder of something ancient and essential. The vision faded, and Victor collapsed to his knees, his chest heaving as he struggled to catch his breath. The hum of the stone lingered in his ears, the vibrations resonating deep within him. The scarred wolf stepped closer, his golden eyes piercing. For a moment, Victor felt as though the wolf could see every hidden part of him, every flaw, every fear. "What d?" The wolf didn't answer, but something in his gaze shifted. It wasn't just understanding, it was trust, a silent acknowledgement that Victor was part of this now. The scarred wolf turned and walked back toward the shadows, his movements slow and deliberate. The other wolves followed, slipping away one by one until the clearing was empty again. Victor sat in silence, the faint glow of the stone casting long shadows across the clearing. Magnum stood beside it, his calm presence steady and grounding. Victor exhaled shakily and rose to his feet, brushing dirt from his knees. He looked at Magnum, the horse's calm gaze meeting his own. "I don't understand all of this," Victor said quietly, "but I think I'm starting to." He reached for the lead rope, his hand steady now, and led Magnum out of the clearing. The forest felt alive around them, every shadow and rustling leaf carrying a sense of purpose. When they reached the edge of the woods, Victor paused and glanced back at the trees. Whatever had started here wasn't over. The forest wasn't done with him. Victor stood at the edge of his estate, staring at the dense forest bathed in the soft glow of dawn. For weeks, the pull of the woods had haunted him, drawing him deeper into its mysteries. But now, as the final piece of the puzzle revealed itself, he understood. The forest wasn't just alive, it was connected to him, Magnum, and the wolves in ways he could no longer deny. Magnum stood beside him, calm and steady, his ears flicking toward the trees as if sensing the significance of what lay ahead. Victor tightened his grip on the lead rope, his breath visible in the crisp morning air. "This is it," he murmured, his voice barely above a whisper. Together, they crossed the threshold into the forest. The path to the clearing felt different this time. The shadows were less menacing, the silence less oppressive. The forest no longer felt like a stranger. Instead, it felt like an old, familiar presence welcoming him back. When they reached the clearing, Victor stopped. The stone stood at its center, glowing faintly as it always did, its ancient markings pulsing with life. The wolves were already there, their golden eyes reflecting the morning light. The scarred leader stepped forward, his gaze unyielding as he locked eyes with Victor. Victor's heart pounded, but he didn't hesitate. He released Magnum's lead rope, allowing the horse to move freely. Magnum approached the stone with purpose, his calm demeanor unshaken. The scarred wolf let out a low rumble, a sound that reverberated through the clearing. It wasn't a warning, but an invitation. Victor stepped forward, the weight of the moment pressing down on him. He stopped beside Magnum, his eyes scanning the glowing symbols on the stone. "I'm here," he said aloud, his voice steady. "What now?" The scarred wolf tilted his head slightly, then howled. It was a long, deep sound, resonant and mournful, carrying a weight Victor couldn't fully grasp. The other wolves joined in, their voices blending into a haunting harmony that echoed through the trees. The stone's glow brightened, the markings pulsing in time with the wolves' howls. Victor felt the hum of energy in his chest, growing stronger with each passing moment. He reached out, placing both hands on the stone. The energy surged through him, and his vision blurred as a flood of images overtook him. This time, the visions were clearer, more vivid. He saw the forest as it had been centuries ago, pristine and untamed, alive with harmony. Humans and animals coexisted, bound by a shared understanding of balance and respect. He saw the wolves and horses, their movements synchronized, their connection unbreakable. And he saw the stone at the heart of it all, a symbol of unity and renewal, its glow a beacon for those who sought to restore what had been lost. Then, he saw himself. Not as an outsider, but as a part of the forest's ancient story. He felt the weight of responsibility settle over him, but it wasn't a burden. It was a purpose. The visions faded, and Victor staggered back, gasping for breath. The clearing was silent now, the hum of the stone soft and steady. The scarred wolf stepped closer, his golden eyes meeting Victor's. There was no fear in those eyes, only trust. "I understand now," Victor said quietly, his voice trembling. "It's about balance. It's always been about balance." The wolf let out a low sound, almost like approval, and then turned toward the shadows. The other wolves followed, disappearing one by one until only Victor and Magnum remained in the clearing. Victor looked at the stone, its glow fading slightly as the energy settled. He turned to Magnum, placing a hand on the horse's neck. "We're part of this now," he said, his voice steady. The walk back through the forest was different. The tension and fear that had once gripped Victor were gone, replaced by a quiet sense of belonging. The trees no longer loomed over him. They stood as sentinels, their presence protective and ancient. When Victor reached the edge of the woods, he paused and looked back. The forest was silent, but he felt its presence as strongly as ever. For the first time in years, Victor felt whole. The forest had changed him, not by force, but by revealing the truth he had always ignored, that life was not about domination, but connection. As he led Magnum back to the estate, Victor knew his life would never be the same. The forest had given him a purpose he couldn't ignore, and he was ready to embrace it. The wolves, the stone, and the forest, they were all part of him now. And for the first time, he felt at peace.